Please note today's session is being recorded, and if you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much, and on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the November Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar. We are excited to welcome such a great panel for our last webinar of 2018. A brief word about logistics and we'll be off. We ask that if you are not already on mute, to please keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, the session is being recorded and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted by using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Please type your question to the provided field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your questions at any point in time. We are going to get the session started off with just a few for our great panel, and then we'll be turning it over to all audience questions. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for joining us. You'll see if you are tracking the limited slides for this presentation, you'll see the smiling faces of the people who we're going to be able to learn from today, Alvin, Etche, and Donna. Just to give you a little bit for anyone who hasn't, a little bit of context for anyone who hasn't tuned into these kind of sessions that we've been doing now for about the last year, it's an opportunity for us to learn from experienced investigators in implementation science on a range of different topics. We moved away from more of the traditional webinars with the slide and PowerPoint presentations and thought that it would be helpful to have more of a discussion. And so as Sarah had mentioned, we would love to have your questions, your comments as we go along. Over the last couple of months, we've been wanting to expand our thinking about what we can do in terms of global implementation science. And so last month, the last webinar that we had was featuring representatives from across the National Institutes of Health talking about the funding climate, some observations about how we might be able to grow the portfolio in that area. And this is sort of part two, where we're now being able to learn from experienced investigators in the field who have been thinking about that interface between implementation science and global health. It's wonderful to have Alvin, Etche, and Donna. Alvin, I remember meeting at, I think it was an NIMH National Institute of Mental Health supported meeting talking about ways to advance implementation science in HIV across the globe. So great to have him back here. Etche, I remember meeting at an NIH PEPFAR meeting around trying to reduce maternal-to-child transmission of HIV, and some of the great work that he's done following trying to set up within Nigeria an implementation science alliance. And then Donna Shelley from NYU, who is a representative of the first year of our Training Institute for Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health back in 2011, being able to see how well she's moved from various areas of expertise and moving in the cancer space, thinking about tobacco control and other avenues, both domestically and internationally, to focus on implementation science. I think among all three of them, they represent a great amount of expertise that we can learn from. And so just to give you a sense of what we'll do, as Sarah had indicated, we have a couple of stimulus questions. This was Campfire, now is Fireside, because at least in our area, the weather has taken a turn for the worse. It's gotten a bit colder, so we thought we're back at the Fireside from the Campfire. You'll see periodic photos representing that fireside or a campfire motif. But what we want to do is start out by learning from each of our distinguished guests a little bit about how they got into this field. So the first question that I just like to pose each of them, and if Etche and then Donna and then Alvin can respond in turn, can each of you tell us a little bit about what it was that inspired you to pursue work in implementation science, a bit about how you found the field when you started working in it, and then maybe any reflections about over the years that you've been engaged in it. How has the field changed? So Etche, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. It's a funny story because the first time I actually found out that I was doing implementation science, I didn't know what it was. I had met with 5 NIH program officers at one of the meetings, and I wanted them to look at my CV. And one of them said, wow, you are scattered. You are doing this on cancer. You are doing this on MRSA. You are doing this on, and you need to focus a little bit more. And then one of the NIH program officers looked at him and said, well, there's a theme to everything that he's doing it's all about implementation science. So I asked him, what is that? And they all burst out, started laughing. So I thought they now explained to me at the beginning of my career what implementation science is. So I went back, learned a little bit more about it, and I found out it was exactly what I was doing. So I was excited until I got a chance to meet the deputy director for NIH. And he said, well, what is the focus of your research? I said, oh, it's implementation science. Then he looked at me and said, well, the NIH is not for you because we discovered those things that NIH people implement. So you can imagine what happened to me. I went back and said, okay, maybe it's not really what I'm doing. But what I found out was at a time when there was so much confusion, the difference between implementation science, operational science, and the different things that evolved over time. So this was when I joined. But right now you can see that almost every NIH institute have a division of implementation science. So I think everybody have come to recognize the importance that implementation science plays in making sure that what we actually discover from the bench goes straight out to have an impact on humans.
Great, thanks. Donna, you want to tell a little bit about your entry into the field?
Sure. Somewhat similar in the sense that I got 2 grants about 16 years ago that were about implementing and disseminating tobacco use treatment guidelines in primary care settings. One was from the state and one was from ARC. And at the time, I didn't know I was doing implementation science. I called it health services research, which was sort of the larger umbrella of what we were doing then. And there was a large literature, obviously, on system changes and organizational change. It included a lot of theories and models. You know, we used competing values framework to analyze the impact of organizational culture on provider adherence to tobacco guidelines. We often implement, you know, sort of using the chronic care. There were models, but it wasn't until sort of a little before that first training in 2011 that you mentioned that I started seeing in the literature I was in the term implementation science. And it was very exciting to me, honestly, because before then I was sort of adrift in this very big umbrella field of health services research without really understanding like who my actual immediate colleagues were. I was really drawn to this because I started seeing the idea of this actually quote-unquote new science because I was feeling that, you know, there was a lack of a unifying literature and theories and models and methods and designs and measures and a way to bring investigators together to advance this work. So I was thrilled. I don't even remember when I saw that sort of information about the training, but that was a real turning point for me, attending that first week-long training. And you know, the networking was as good as the feedback and information I got, because it is a complex field. So that was really exciting. And I'm sort of inspired to do the work because I'm really, at the core, really interested in understanding how to get things done and implemented. You know, not only just getting science into practice, but working with my own health system to become what we're all talking about now, a learning health system. And frankly, without applying implementation science frameworks to that work, it's hard to see that work actually meeting its goals. So, you know, I've been working a lot with my health system as well as doing research. And in terms of the change in the field, I mean, it's been a sea change even in the last 7 years. Is now our own new organization, the Society for Implementation Science and Collaboration. There's the annual D&I meetings. There's, you know, lots of new frameworks and models. And the DIRH study section, I think, has been a game changer as well. For those of us who don't know, the Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health, it's a sort of almost a safe space for those of us who want to submit these kinds of grants to NIH, where the grant will be met by a reviewer who really has expertise in this field. So that's where I am.
Great, thanks. Alvin, can you weigh in on sort of how you got engaged in this field and how you've seen it change over the time?
Thanks for a great question. So I think my comments very much echo those of my colleagues. You know, I was a medical resident in New York City in the kind of like the late 90s, early 2000s, and at the time, you know, there were antiretrovirals had just come online. And you know, people were very excited about it, and you know, there was a new paper almost every week about its efficacy. But on the other hand, on the wards, there were still sort of like so many patients with complications of advanced AIDS, and it just struck me that there was this, you know, this very sort of urgent disconnect between what tools we had and you know, putting them into use. And I didn't, you know, I wasn't aware of the term implementation science at the time, and I wasn't, you know, aware of it until sort of years later. But when I came across it, you know, I think I had a feeling, sort of an aha moment, much the way that my colleagues have also described. But you know, we're okay. So this is a thing, and there's a body of literature around it, and there are emerging perspectives and frameworks for it, and sort of a community of people who are kind of interested in thinking about these same kinds of things. So I think that's what sort of initially got me excited about pursuing, you know, scholarship in implementation science. And I think over the years things have changed over a relatively short period of time. You know, I think even a few years ago when you said in the HIV space, you know, there was kind of, even a few years ago, I think the idea that you needed a science of implementation wasn't yet fully agreed on. But now I think that almost everybody recognizes that there is a gap between evidence and practice, and that there needs to be a scientific lens put on that gap. I think that's almost universal. And when I heard about you know, when my basic scientist colleagues are talking about the cascade of care, it provided some confidence that, you know, this had become quite penetrant. And I think right now we're at a place where there's sort of an emerging consensus on how to do it and what the boundaries of it are and things like that. But I think it's certainly come a long way from the days from which, you know, I think the term was relatively unknown, and there wasn't an agreement that such a thing was sort of needed at all. But let me stop there. But those were my initial, you know, my initial experience with implementation science.
Yeah, and I think it tracks pretty well, as we've been seeing just with each year. It seems like there are more people who are not asking that question of, are these studies that we should do, and have advanced to the point of saying, yeah, there's a fair number of things, as each of you have represented. There's a fair number of ongoing activities. There's an understanding of where do we go to identify resources that are helpful. And so, you know, great that each of you have helped, you know, as the field has been maturing. Because each of you, as opposed to some of the folks who we've had in past months, have a specific focus on global implementation science, I wonder if we could ask each of you to talk a little bit about what you would see as specific priority areas in global implementation science that you'd encourage not only those listening, but just the broader community to undertake. And maybe if we started with Donna, and then moved to Alvin, and then to Etche as the third. Could each of you just give your take on what priority research areas you see?
Sure. So I am doing a project in Vietnam on implementing tobacco use treatment guidelines in the public health system. And in tobacco control, we actually have a treaty that the WHO, World Health Organization, created, and it was signed by over 140 countries. And it's an evidence-based treaty. So there's this entire focus of multiple articles that are sort of promoting evidence-based policies and practices and programs. And so I've been thinking, and I'm focused on specifically on the cessation piece. But I mean, in terms of research, the World Health Organization has a multitude of guidelines as well. And so, you know, there's a lot of need to sort of take what we know and adapt it to these global contexts, which are very different than you know, where we live and where we work and the kinds of populations we study. And so I don't think it's enough to be able to say, at least certainly in my work and my colleagues work globally, that we can just kind of superimpose what we think we're finding out in implementation science works in terms of implementing guidelines or evidence-based or science into practice and policy, and sort of just plop it down into these contexts. And so there is work that needs to be done to do adaptation, tailoring of the work that we have been doing in high-income countries. And just in terms of need, I see a real big need in training. And it would be great if Fogarty could, in every single training grant that they fund, have an implementation science component in it. There's just a real lack of knowledge and understanding of what this science is in places I've been working and my colleagues have been working in low-middle income countries. And so, we talk about training. We're doing such a good job here in the U.S. in providing training, multitudes of options, but there's very little to offer, actually, in terms of funding for that. And the addition is the training in countries like Vietnam, where the Ministry of Health really runs the systems and funds the systems and provides the resource. Training at that level would be actually really helpful. I also alluded to the idea of just the need to adapt to not just sort of the evidence-based strategies, implementation strategies, but the training tools we're using, the research, the measures that we're using. We just did a study analyzing how the consolidated framework for implementation science works actually in Vietnam, in that culture. And there were some interesting findings there. So that it's not just, the frameworks that we're using and the measures that we're developing, they also really need to be adapted locally. I think working with the World Health Organization and specifically their implementation research platform could be really exciting and helpful. I haven't had an opportunity to do that. I know they have one, and I think it's been focused more on maybe HIV and maternal health. I think that's, right, I'll stop there actually and let others comment.
Cool, thanks for that. Alvin, your thoughts about priority areas in global implementation science?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just, my work has been with HIV treatment in resource sort of limited settings or lower middle income countries. And so I think that, obviously the hallmark of HIV treatment is its longitudinal nature, and, benefits are only optimized when people are able to access and stay on treatment for a sustained period of time. And that is, I think, a good jumping off point for, I think both in emerging epidemiologic transition that's, already happened in much of the world and will happen in Africa, where, I think sort of engagement in care over time for chronic conditions and non-communicable diseases will also be in a big part of the universal sort of health coverage agenda. And so I think that I think it's exciting to think about deepening the learning from the sort of HIV response to a broader sort of engagement with health in places where there are sort of limitations in the health system, there are structural barriers, there are, sort of competing livelihood demands, et cetera. So I think that's an important area globally from a substantive point of view. And then from a sort of a more methods perspective, I think, in much of the world, or in some of, in some lower middle income countries, the policy-making environment is diverse, and there are many actors, right? So there's international agencies, there's sort of U.S. government, there's national governments, there's NGOs, there's civil society, and I think that's kind of sort of hallmark of the macroscopic implementation environment in global health is an area that is different, from the macroscopic environment in the United States and in Europe, and warrants, I think, some more sort of theorizing and thought about that. So that's an exciting area too, and think there's some great emerging scholarship there, and look forward to seeing more on that.
Great, thanks for that. Etche, your thoughts about priority areas in global implementation science?
So one of the things that interests me in implementation science is really to develop implementation strategies. I love to develop strategies that are not really focused on individual disease, but a strategy that becomes a framework for multiple interventions. As you may remember, one of the strategies we developed was the baby shower initiative. The baby shower initiative was a way to create a framework where we can identify pregnant women early, where we can implement any intervention for any specific disease, and where we can follow up those pregnant women after delivery. So with that framework and that implementation strategy that we developed, we have been able to use that to do breast cancer screening. We use it to look at smoking cessation. We use it to look at sickle cell screening. We use it to look at hepatitis B screening. This was initially developed for HIV. So one of the things that interests me is how can we create implementation strategies that people can use those frameworks to look at how to move. If you think about it, why is screening for sickle cell not where it should be in countries where they have more than we do in the U.S.? Then you look at the problem, and you can find out that you can use what PEPFAR had developed, the framework PEPFAR had developed for HIV program. You draw blood for HIV, and then you can do HIV and you throw away the remaining blood. But then you can use that same blood to do hepatitis B screening, for sickle cell screening. So looking at frameworks instead of individual targeted strategy for individual diseases, that's what is interesting to me. And I think in these countries globally where they don't have as much resources as we have here in the U.S., they're looking at those framework strategies that are not in silos will be the next thing that will be helpful to us.
Mm-hmm. So the idea of sort of more integration across different health topics by way of not, basically taking advantage of activities that are going on and saying it might not only be this one health area, we may be able to broaden our focus on a range of different health areas with the very same biomaterial, right?
Exactly. If I have pregnant women and their male partners in a place talking about HIV, there's no reason why Donna cannot talk about cigarette smoking cessation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Sarah's going to jump in just for a second.
Just as a quick note to folks on the line, one, if you want to go ahead and monitor the chat function, it's on the right-hand side of your screen. I've just been updating it, so I actually went ahead and provided a link to the WHO Implementation Research Toolkit learning portal that Donna had mentioned earlier. And so one, I'll be updating that space with resources as we move through the conversation. And second, as a quick reminder that you are able to type your questions in the Q&A or into the chat and send them our way, and we are happy to ask them of our panelists today. So feel free to do that, and we have some more questions ready to go.
Yeah, right. So as you type them in, we'll be able to integrate them into the discussion. In the meantime, while you're thinking about those questions, wanted to get a little bit of a sense from our speakers, some thoughts about training, particularly in global implementation science, and whether it's reflecting on your own experiences in training or in delivering training to other folks. What types of training or mentoring do you think are needed to build further capacity for our global implementation scientists? And maybe we can have Alvin start out, followed by Etche, and then Donna. So Alvin, any thoughts about the kinds of training in this particular space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two threads to this sort of, I think, training that maybe I could just comment briefly on. One is I think what's generally very fun about implementation science training, which is getting people to think about the value and the impact of potential research through, a lens that's not that's outside of perhaps some of the traditional focuses, and calls attention to things like external validity and implementability and things like that. And I think that a lot of that knowledge among people who have been in the health delivery space, whether they're sort of professionals or people who work in public health, like that's the material that you sort of swim in all day in your day-to-day existence. And then implementation science training takes that and you know, it is able to offer sort of at this point like a sort of a canon of formalized ways of thinking about it, which I think people find very fun because it resonates with their experience. I don't know that we have, I think as Donna alluded to, that many opportunities in the international setting for that to happen, and even in our sort of U.S.-based setting where at UCSF there are a lot of resources for implementation science, I still am not sure we've been able to meet the need locally, and because there's just a tremendous amount of interest. And then I guess like the other part of this, which I think is harder, is that is in a training environment. You know, there are a lot of things about the conduct of implementation science that make the traditional things about sort of, you know, human subjects research like sampling and measurement error and, you know, how you approach analyses and things like that, harder because you are dealing with environments where information arises with less control through the part of the investigator. And so I think that it's more sort of training that sort of meets those needs is also something that's very much needed, and both I think here and in particular in the international space for our you know, colleagues based in other countries. But let me stop there and yeah.
Well, thanks, Etche. Your thoughts about training, the kinds of training needed to build capacity in global implementation science?
So, you know, until now, one of our focus on training has been on the PI. And that has been very interesting to see that when I actually go down, especially in the global arena, to implement studies, I find out that the biggest part of the training that I needed to do was also in the research coordinators and research assistants. They have to understand the difference between research and programs. That, you know, when you set up a research question and you design it to answer that question, that it doesn't matter whether he answers it to the negative or the positive. You do it methodologically and let the result be what they are. They still see it as a program where they have to succeed, so they have to do everything to succeed. So they want to increase the number of people who tested for HIV. I say, no, that's not your role. Your role is to implement this and let's see whether it leads to it. So one of the things I would like to see change a little bit in the way we do the training is to use a team-based approach for training, where we just don't select the PI, but actually select the PI's team. So the PI, the study coordinator, and maybe a study research assistant, and do a team-based training. One of the things I found, I don't know if you remember this, David, is the PMCT Alliance. And one of the things they did from NICH, Dan, and Pepper was to bring the researcher, brought down the implementing partner, and brought up the policymaker from the country where they have their study, and brought them all together in the same room. That did a lot of changes. It made the implementing partner understand what I, as the researcher, understood. At least he said, well, now I can understand why you want to do it this way. It even made the policymaker understand why they are important, even in the research, because in implementation science, we're talking about from evidence to practice to policy. So I think using a little more of a team-based approach to training would be something I would like to see.
Great. Thanks, Donna. Your thoughts about training? Oh, nope. Did we lose? We might have lost Donna for the moment.
Sorry, I was muting because of
okay. There you go. I was taking a gulp. Okay.
There are a lot of ambulances near where I am.
Yeah, gotcha. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So your thoughts about training would be great.
So, yeah, I've been thinking as I'm hearing everybody, the others speak, that there are two different target populations in terms of this idea of training. We talked about there's the local partners, academic, NGO, you know, Ministry of Health research partners that we have there that could use training in this area. But then obviously, you know, how do we build the next generation of U.S. investigators who can do this kind of work globally? And I think some of the things I'll just reflect on what struck me personally and what I was missing in terms of my own expertise. I think some basic training in implementation science that is available through a whole different venues, which maybe Sarah can share with online is really important, sort of just the core principles of implementation science and, how do you apply frameworks and theories in this field is sort of the core of implementation science is sort of that, the basic kinds of training that has been offered and continues to be offered. But in terms of the international setting, I think this idea of team-based research too in science is really relevant there. And how do you work with not only different disciplines, but folks with different levels of expertise and training and education? How do you sort of adapt to a very diverse team, actually, when you're working in these settings, and sort of make sure that everybody is feeling like they're engaged. And I think we talk about. I mean, I've worked with folks, and I've done this kind of work with community-based participatory research, and the idea of engaging partners really engaging partners in a sort of substantive way in this work when you're on the ground internationally. I think that's something that we think on paper sounds like, oh, gee, we all know how to do that. But actually, there's a skill to that, and there's training that needs to be happening around how you actually do community-based participatory research well, how you build a team on the ground, and work productively with people, as I said, that are very diverse in their knowledge and education and experience. The other thing is cultural competency, which I've found it very challenging working in Asia. I'm a native New Yorker. I like to say what I think, and there's the cultural competency component that is really, really important when you're a visitor and you don't live in this country and you're working, you're in their home, and so that's another piece that I think would have been really helpful to understand. And the other thing, I think you brought up this idea of program evaluation, process evaluation versus implementation science, and I think just even kind of understanding the terminologies and the differences between those things and the similarities, frankly, because a lot of folks, we've worked with in Vietnam really talk about program evaluation, and they don't always see the difference between what we're talking about in terms of implementation as science as a science and applying scientific principles and design different, sort of rigorous designs to the work we're trying to do versus, this idea of program evaluation. So I think kind of understanding the differences, the similarities, how you explain sort of what's the added value of implementation science in the field could be also helpful.
Great. And just to say thank you and to reinforce the fact that we now have participants who have been starting to submit questions, I want to start with one, and this is a question for any of you who want to jump in. But the question asks, what models are each of you using to build implementation science capacity within the international research teams that you're working with, and potentially more broadly? So are there any specific approaches toward building capacity there that any of you might want to reflect on?
David, maybe I could ask for maybe a little bit of clarification on that question. Sort of, is this like about models for sort of training, or maybe I'm not getting the question?
Yeah, so if the person who had submitted the question in the chat might want to add in, the way I interpreted at least was, yes, different models. That if you identify you're in a place that may not have as much capacity to study the implementation of different interventions, are there things that you've done within those within countries, within specific communities, to try to build more capacity so that your team is better equipped to conduct global implementation science? That's how I interpret it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I'll take a quick stab at this, but look forward to hearing my colleagues' perspectives as well. I mean, so I've been fortunate in that, I've had sort of colleagues from the countries where we've been working in, in Kenya and in other places that have had a tremendous amount of knowledge, both formal and informal, about implementation science. And I think that one of the things that we've tried to do to build, both here in the U.S. in our local environment and there, is we've really relied very heavily on kind of social media to create kind of, a community of practice in a sense. And, we disseminate information. We have sort of lab group meetings. We share like little sort of tweet-like observations when different people are at different meetings. And I don't know if this is at all what the question is about, but it's I'm on the West Coast, and it's 10 or 11 hours, depending on daylight savings, to Kenya, which is often a detriment. But it also there's oftentimes kind of like a robust chatter over sort of social media about these things, and we've found that to be, quite engaging and powerful. I guess that's, I hope I might not have completely missed the mark, but
no, that's great. Yeah, wonder if Donna or Eche have any thoughts to add.
David,
yeah.
So David, there's a strategy that we use. I don't know if I will call it a model, but it's giving us a quite good return. So what we did is this: every time we get an R01, we break down the M's into the M1, M2, M3. Then I pick, and I actually advertise it in the country. I work a lot in Nigeria. So I look at people who want to learn implementation science, who have not been able to get a grant. I take them and I divide those M's to them and give it to them. I like a mini D43, so to say. I use my M on this study and say, M1, you become in charge of it. M2, you become in charge of it. M3, and as I walk through this, you can see I use that to train in terms of design, in terms of actual implementation, evaluation, and all the rest of it. And I come back to the U.S., I have my PhD students, and I pair them with those in those countries. So that in each grant R01 that we have 6 mentees, which means each M that we have one in the LMIC country and one here in the U.S. who is either a postdoc or a PhD student that we pair, and they take those M's individually. And what we have found out is that at the end of those studies, each of them have been this is the best we have had. And right now, what happened is that almost everybody wants to take an independent study and do one of those with me. And what I started asking them, what is it that they like the most about it? They said something about using a practical question, like an M that you have designed, teaching around it, using it for them to actually increase their own capacity about understanding how you came to those questions, how you designed it the first way, and seeing those things go through implementation. It's one of the strategies that we've had a lot of feedback from. The first time we did it, all the 6 people that we work with, all of them got a published paper, and 3 of them have now put in an R03. So that's something that we thought was a very good practical way to do it for us.
Great, thanks for that. Donna, anything additional to add?
I would just add that one of the ways we're doing this is by including students in the same MPH and doctoral students, giving them an opportunity to use our databases for their dissertations or their written, now the master's programs at Hainan Medical University and other universities are requiring students to publish in an English language journal before they graduate. And so by making our research and our data available and then using that as an opportunity then to mentor those students has been one way in which we are also trying to build capacity.
Thank you. So wanted to pick up on another question that came in, and that was from each of your experiences, how you compare implementation in U.S. versus some of the work that you've done in other countries. There is a specific question asking, on top of that, do you involve medical associations of that community to support how you're delivering messages across the vulnerable population that you're working in? But I think even that broad question of how your work domestic to the U.S. compares with the work that you're doing internationally, and any comments that you have on there. Maybe if we could start with Eche, and then Donna, and then Alvin.
Maybe I should unmute.
No, can you repeat the question, David?
Sure. It was basically if you think about work that you've done that some of you have done in the U.S. versus work that you've done in other countries, are there key differences either in the approach or the way in which you're conducting the study that differ if you're working in this country, in the U.S. versus in other countries?
Yes, there's a lot of difference. I think the major one that I picked up very early is the amount of time you have to dedicate to training and retraining and retraining if you don't want things to go wrong. So if I was doing study in this country, I usually could say 3 months I can get it started and I can get things working along. Really, I spend the first month doing the first training, and after the first training and things start, I give them about a month, I go back again. And this initial training is important because we go over things. So, you know, maybe you're trying to get recruitment and then you don't want to get to half of your recruitment to realize that errors have been made. So the amount of training, upfront training that you do is a return on investment. That I found, again, here comes in the issue because a lot of the training, even though in those countries you may have multiple PIs or investigators that are very good, when it comes down to the coordinators and the RAs, you really have to be involved in that training so that they understand, again, what is the difference between programs and research and why the way it's being implemented are different. While one is to lay out and look at the outcome, the other one you try to influence the outcome. So this is one of the things that I've learned so well that is so different from how I approach the studies here because I tend to have a lot more ability to get MPH students, PhD students who can be my study coordinators or research assistants who have a different vast knowledge than what I get when I practice outside of this country. So I think the upfront training for the research team has been something that I got a lot of return on investment.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Donna.
So just to add, you know, we're working with faculty from major universities and in a research institute, and yet you can't. What I learned is you can't assume that folks, even when they've been trained as investigators, think about things like IRB like we do and data management like we do. I think the human subjects research training that was required on our end, thinking, building on the idea of needing training, was significant, and that I didn't actually even anticipate. So that piece required quite a bit of training, and then thinking about data collection in the field in these kinds of settings is really different too. We're all using REDCap here. How do you get people online into these sort of cloud-based data collection systems so that you can share data in real time? And that's something that took some time to figure out in the field as well. And I would say the last thing is that, these are totally different systems that you're working in when you're going globally with as I think it was Etche said, far fewer resources than we're used to seeing. And so there's a lot of adjustments and adaptation, and I'd say that the amount of pilot and formative research that we have done in our work internationally is far greater than we need to do when we're working in the U.S. Just to sort of really understand the systems that you're working in really well takes a lot of time and a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, so that everybody's sort of on the same page about what you're talking about in terms of changing these systems and what's feasible and what's not.
Great, thanks. Alvin, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I sort of understood the question a little bit differently, and I may be wrong, but I guess if I could paraphrase, there are, I think, unique challenges to forming collaborations from the perspective of somebody who's academically based and looking, to work with implementers, whether it's government or NGOs, and there are certainly unique, dimensions of this when we're thinking about sort of working with the San Francisco Department of Health here in San Francisco, or perhaps like the Ministry of Health in Zimbabwe. But there are also, broadly speaking, I think a lot of similarities, and it starts with sort of, I think, building a common understanding and a relationship, and getting to the point where you could sort of dive into something together and be on the same page. But I on some level, I feel like there are a lot of similarities there, and there are sort of common challenges to building these kind of collaborations and relationships, across these settings, which have, in my mind, over time, become more prominent than the differences.
Can I just comment on that? Because I think that resonated with me is that this idea, implementation science, it requires building stakeholder groups from different sectors of society and different disciplines of research, and so that really resonates because you're right. I mean, at least that's in my experience, is that is a challenge in the U.S. and that's been a challenge, where I'm working internationally. And the players are not always the same, and sort of when you're going to another country, figuring out who those people are requires that it can take some time, and bringing those people together is just a process that you have to go through carefully, and as carefully as you would in the U.S. But I agree. Like, there are a lot of similarities, in terms of that piece of building that team, building stakeholder buy-in and stakeholder groups. And the work we've been doing, we have a really robust external advisory group that cuts across different sectors, health, academic, NGOs, and it's been really helpful in terms of understanding the meaning of the work we're doing, how it might be sustainable, and sort of where the next steps are.
Great, thanks.
So let me add something. There is one thing that I found that was very helpful to us, which NIH actually provided to us, which is the idea of a multiple PI. So I've tended to use that in all my studies abroad now. The reason I find that is that there is an equal ownership in those approach. So before I even send the grant, I understand who in that field, in that country, in that environment can help bring people together for me. So that multiple PI person doesn't need to have the same kind of expertise they have. Actually, they complement me. So when I may not know who the players are, they know. When I may not be able to bring the players to the table, they do. When I am not able to reach to the president, to the governor, they get me access. So I choose wisely on who my multiple PIs are, and what I found out is that once I do that, I can focus on some of the sciences they may not have the expertise in, while they focus on those building a network that is required for you to successfully do implementation science. And I found those very, very helpful. One, I tell them that I no longer have to beg you to do stuff for me because we are both PIs and we have responsibility to get this done. So it took me away from asking them to do stuff for me, and I said, well, it's your responsibility. You signed this PI with me, and this is your responsibility, this is mine. So it took away the idea of they were working for me, but that they're doing their job and I'm doing mine. And it was very helpful to me.
Great. Thanks for those thoughts. Another question that we have here asks for any of you, what strategies have you used to identify and prioritize implementation research questions with your partners in country? Any thoughts about that?
I guess this is Donna. From my perspective, I have a partner. It's funny. I had a doctoral student. Sometimes these relationships and are sort of opportunistic, but when the Framework Convention came out, there was an opportunity. The Framework Convention wasn't getting implemented, essentially, and there was an opportunity to do that. And I actually was contacted by someone in Vietnam who had started a research institute and was doing public health research and evaluation, and sort of, asked me to come meet with them and the Ministry of Health to talk about this issue that they were having and sort of in implementing the components of the Framework Convention. And so I think if I don't know if I'm answering that question, actually. It was a question to how you find partners, or, I'm sorry.
No, it was more when you're trying to identify and prioritize the specific questions to be asked, or any strategies with the partners, so that I presume the questioner is asking, so that to make sure that it's as relevant to the population as possible. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I actually had conversations, but I physically went there to speak to the Ministry of Health and other groups to find out whether, in fact, this was, was a smoking, were they worried about Article 14? Was that something they were prioritizing? In fact, they were actually prioritizing implementing smoke-free air policies and taxes increases, and had been doing a lot of that work already. And in fact, they were just getting started and thinking about how would they roll out smoking cessation services throughout their public health system. So it was about kind of, I think it's critical to check in. I mean, just because you want to do something and this is your area of research may not be, it may not be where they're at, as a system in terms of where their priorities are in that particular area. So in tobacco control, which is my area, most countries who have signed on are trying to do implementation, but they may not be wanting to implement all of those components. And so checking in, literally physically going there and meeting with those folks was critically important. It was very hard to do this work, on WebEx and phone, meeting with the right people, as well as sort of the medical schools and understanding kind of where they were and their priorities around training. So yeah, I mean, I had a sense that they were interested in implementing tobacco control, evidence-based tobacco control components, but whether it was cessation or not required really checking in with the Ministry of Health and seeing where they were.
I agree with Donna. I think it's going to be very difficult to do a good implementation science work without actually traveling to those places to meet the people that you work with, because it's quite different. And one of the things we had done, David, I'm hoping that you will come to Nigeria next 2018 to the Nigerian Implementation Science Alliance. And what we did basically was to look at all the implementing partners, local environment in Nigeria that were funded by the U.S. government. So we approached all of them and brought them together to a table and said, all of you are working, all of you are supported by the U.S. Funding, either through PEPFAR, through NIH, through the CDC, or through USAID. So we got together and formed this. Everybody keep the organization, but we formed an alliance that we call Nigerian Implementation Science Alliance, and we meet every year. We have now met in 2015, 2016, and 2017. And during that, what we do is that we invite researchers who work in Nigeria to come, and then we have these implementing partners who are actually implementing programs down there, and we bring in the government. So in those 3 meetings, the Minister for Health has been there, and all the head of the health agencies in Nigeria have been at this meeting. And one of the questions we throw to them is, what is your problem that you need solving? So one of the things is, instead of doing the push to them, we try to do a pull from them to say, this is our problem, this is one area that we want to be solved. And then we sit down with them and say, okay. So I usually say there are 5 things we are going to do today, and this is how we write grants. By the time I actually come from those trips, I have my grant written. But I said, okay, so what is the issue that you're having? So once we describe it, so then what do we know about these issues? What is it that you know so much? And they'll tell me. So we know that the pregnant women don't go to the hospital, that instead they will go to traditional better attendants, and we haven't been able to reach those people because they're not recognized as healthcare providers. But also the women will go to churches, but they won't go to hospitals. So I look at what is known. Then I ask myself, so what are the research questions here that we don't know? Is it that, do we know that if we put clinics in the churches, will women come? Is that the question? So I kind of work with them to define what the gap is, the research gap is. And once I do that, then I said, we start working against what are the things, how can we really propose something that we're going to do? What's the intervention that they think will work? And then when I come back here, my work is actually in terms of designing it and looking at the approach on how to actually get it done. But I think having a way that you can listen to them, and the reason it has done for us is that, like right now, we have a grant that actually we have with the 5 major IPs in the country that provide care to HIV participants in the entire 36 states. So what happens is that if what we're doing with them works, in terms of adoption and dissemination, it's already built into our grant. Because if each of those 5 partners adopts what they worked with, they agree that we found that works, and they adopt it, we would have disseminated this to the 36 states in the country. So I think that investment in the early time has really paid off for us in terms of being able to prioritize, because we ask ourselves 5 things or so, 4 things to call it a fast. So we say, is what we're proposing, is it feasible in this place? Is it culturally accepted? Is it sustainable in this place? And does it actually lead to any transformational change? So if you meet our first question, then that's how we prioritize what we do, so that we know that is something that is important to them and is of interest to us as a research question. So that's the approach that we have used. And at the end of those sessions, you could call it a session, we actually do publish something we call like a white paper, where it's an agreement of what the issues are, and then we start to pick them one by one to develop into research questions and designs.
Great. I'm realizing that we only have a few minutes left, and there's some wonderful questions here, just wanting to advance. There was one question that was about specifically about strategies for writing the grants and how we include everything. Just because we might not have as much time to get to that, I'd encourage folks that on the implementation science website of the NCI, we have a few different grants that our investigators have been generous enough to share with everybody, and Donna's R01 actually is one of those. So encourage anyone who's interested in learning about how funded investigators have navigated all of the different things that you have to include. That's a place that you can go, and I'm sure Sarah can plug in that, or has the resource for that. I do want to ask a specific question of each of you quickly, and that's because we have a lot of people who are at earlier stages of their thinking about implementation science who often tune into this. Any advice that you have for people at that earlier stage of their career who are contemplating a career in global implementation science? Anything quickly that you would tell them? Maybe starting with Alvin, what advice would you give?
Thanks. I think that, you know, this is all sort of non-science stuff, but it's about, I think, like the practice of perhaps global health. Number one, I think you really have to ask yourself if you like, if you're sort of, I think, in many ways like a people person, because this is all about relationships, and it's about relationships that are going to be, you know, across time zones, across cultures, sometimes across languages, and a commitment to sort of making those sort of work and enjoyable and uplifting for everybody, I think is a deep part of this work, I think. The other thing is, of course, that you know, there is being spread out, like geographically, having to travel. I mean, I think we all travel in our various like professional capacities across a lot of different professions. But I think in global health, it's definitely a part of it, and it does create, you know, certain tensions in one's life, and those are going to be things that one has to grapple with and decide if they fit. But that's, I think, an important part of it that may look less daunting on the front end than it does sometimes years later. But maybe those are my quick thoughts on that.
Great. Others, Etche or Donna, advice you have for folks?
I would just go ahead, Etche.
Okay, so one thing I keep on my table is this quotation that I remind myself every time. I said that little productivity is ever achieved by people who lack passion for their chosen purpose. So I say the first time you're going to do this, it's going to be more work than you can imagine. Mm-hmm. So pick on something that you're passionate about. If not, you'll be discouraged the first time. So, but if it is something that is passionate for whatever reason, and sometimes it's personal. I remember a friend of mine wanted to work in sickle cell because he has a son who has sickle cell trait. And that's something, passion that was pushing them. So I would say in the first things you want to do this, pick something that you would have you love to do, you would have loved to look into, and that passion can help you with all of those things that that Evan has talked about, the travel, the stress that comes with it. If it's something you're passionate about, the passion will carry you through.
Great.
I'll just add one sort of concrete thing that I think finding a mentor who's working globally, regardless of whether they were doing implementation science or not, would be a good start, because you could, if they were interested, add that component to the work and even build a K award off of a current international grant that adds a sort of an implementation science component. Because, there's nothing like working with someone who's already actually been on the ground and sort of come across all these challenges that we've been talking about and has the experience to sort of work under. Let me just add also, by the way, David, in terms of writing grants, the Implementation Science Journal has protocol papers that I would highly recommend reading because they're essentially the grants that people have submitted. And so just as a resource, and look at some of the global ones, particularly if you're interested in this work, and see how people are designing these studies and what they're doing, the questions they're asking, and the kinds of partnerships they're building.
Great, thanks so much. And recognizing that there are a couple of extra questions that we're not going to be able to get to, but we will try and follow up with those of you who have asked them, just so that we can make sure to tie up any loose ends. With that, just want to thank the three of you for giving us such great advice across a range of different topics. And let me turn things over to Sarah to close us out.
Great, thank you so much, David. Your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete our online evaluation. A link to the survey will open in a new window once this session has concluded. An archive of today's session will be made available shortly on our website. We hope to see you in the new year for another year of engaging implementation science discussions. Details will be made in late November for that first session. Thank you again for joining us today. You may disconnect at this time. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.